the tear gas it really had became really became one of the defining aspects of Hong Kong experience last year. But when we had the umbrella movement in 2014, police fired tear gas on one day, the first day of those protests, and that prompted such shock and outrage that the police should be firing tear gas on unarmed civilian protesters that thousands of people came out onto the streets in anger, and that prompted what ultimately became the umbrella movement, a 3-month occupation of the center of the city. And that was, as I said, one day in 2014. Now, in the course of the protest last year, we had tear gas fired on every single weekend but one for 7 months, and often fired on many other days during the week as well. So, and ultimately tear gas was fired in every single district across the city at certain points of the protests. And there were some days when there were very large-scale protests across the city where simultaneously tear gas was being fired in half a dozen different spots all the way across the city. Police really turned to tear gas as their primary means of policing crowds during the protest last year. Now, what was shocking was really two things. Firstly, the extent to which tear gas has been used, just so extensively in such huge numbers during the protests in Hong Kong, and also how quickly it was normalized. Unlike in 2014, the firing of tear gas didn't cause shock anymore. People expected it from the police, learned to deal with it, learned the right protective gear to wear against it, or various techniques for putting out the tear gas canisters. And it became, as I say, so normalized that there evolved this saying of, you're not a real Hong Konger if you haven't tasted tear gas, because so many Hong Kongers had been out on the streets and had been tear gassed by the police. And yes, I among them, having been a regular observer of the protests, had the experience of being tear gassed on many occasions. So it really became this central feature of Hong Kong experience last year. And now it had two interesting side effects. In terms of the people doing the tear gassing, it seemed clear that it was intended to have two effects. Firstly, the effect of dispersing a crowd, the effect of irritating a crowd with tear gas to make it uncomfortable and forcing them to disperse and flee the area. The psychological impact of the tear gas on people being gassed in terms of causing them to be frightened and disoriented and to lose the solidarity of the crowd. But it's also helpful, I think, from the people doing the gassing's point of view, from the police point of view, to turn a protest gathering into a riot. Once you gas a crowd and they turn into this seething, chaotic mass of people, some fighting back, some fleeing, I think it becomes easier then for the police to objectify the crowd and to treat them as criminals who are properly the subject of coercive policing tactics. I think it helps psychologically to help the police treat the crowds less like fellow citizens, less like fellow members of their community, and more like criminals. And that psychological effect was also seen in the terms of the people that were being tear gassed. It very quickly developed into an agent that built the solidarity of the crowd. And many times I'd seen the crowds hit by tear gas, they would disperse, but then as soon as the tear gas cleared, they would come back together again. They would reform the crowd, and they would often be chanting. And the chant they would be often chanting was "Hong Kong Yan Gayo," "Go Hong Kongers," this sort of identity-focused rallying cry. And this experience of being tear gassed and this sort of us and them experience dynamic that it built up really helped to build up the animosity of the people against the police. And that, together with many examples of police violence or overly coercive policing in the course of the protests last year, really caused a great deal of anger at the police. And it led to this change of dynamic that you were alluding to, Rowan, that previously the Hong Kong police were seen as a benign, highly respected police force, a police force known as Asia's finest, seen in the model of community policing, that they were with the support of the community and the consent of the community, helping to maintain law and order in the community. And it's a model that many civilized places such as Australia like to adhere to with their police forces. And Hong Kong had that. But in the course of the protest last year, with the tear gassing, with the violence, with the police being forced by the government to the front lines and being forced to use coercive law and order tactics to try and resolve this political problem, they became hated. And the model really shifted from this community policing model to a colonial policing model, where the police have effectively become Beijing's enforcers on the ground in Hong Kong. And I think this is one of the great tragedies and great casualties of last year's protest movement, has been the relationship between the Hong Kong people and their police force.